My name is Todd Myers. I'm 64 years old, and I gave one company 45 years of my life. Last March, that company invited my son to give the tribute speech at my retirement dinner. I sat in the front row next to my wife while he stood at the podium and told 140 people that his father was a good man who had become outdated. Some of them laughed. Colleen took my hand and held it flat against her knee. I had a small brass stamp in my jacket pocket, and I could feel the weight of it against my ribs the whole time. There was a woman sitting at table 4 who had flown in that morning. She had one sheet of paper in her bag with one name printed on it. Before I take you back there, please take a moment to like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I read every one. Now let me take you back to September of last year, the morning I found out my own retirement date from a company newsletter. The break room at Kestrel Valve and Forge smells like burnt coffee at 6:40 in the morning. It has smelled that way since 1981. I came in off the floor with my gloves still on and stopped at the corkboard by the vending machine because there was a new sheet pin there with the company letterhead across the top. Halfway down the page, under a photo of the Christmas party, I found my own name. Join us in celebrating Todd Myers' well-earned retirement effective March 27. I read it 3 times. I was still holding a cup of coffee, and I had to set it on the table because my hand wasn't steady. I had never told anybody I was retiring. Nobody had asked me. At 9 o'clock, Lyle Kearns called in all hands in the shipping bay. Lyle had been our chief operating officer for 18 months. He came from outside, and he learned everybody's first name in a week, which is a skill I've never known how to admire properly. He talked about legacy. He said 45 years twice. Then he started clapping, and 140 people clapped with him, and Ronnie from the tool crib whistled. I stood up and nodded because I couldn't think of anything else a man does in that situation. Sitting back down, I did the arithmetic without meaning to. I started at Kestrel on May 12, 1981. March 27 wasn't my 45th anniversary. It was 7 weeks short of it. Behind Lyle, the projector clicked to the next slide. The clapping was still going. The Kestrel logo slid off, and a new one came up in gray and navy, a consulting firm called Sherwood Klein Partners, with one line underneath it. Modernization Program Phase 1. That date wasn't picked for me. It took me 5 months to find out who it was picked for. I want you to see the place before the rest of this happens. The heat treat bay at 5 in the morning is the best room I've ever stood in. 2 furnaces, an oil quench tank, and a hum you feel in your back teeth. The smell is scorched oil and hot brick. In winter, the whole bay runs about 90 degrees, and men from the machine shop find reasons to walk through. I wrote our process in 1996. It took 11 failures and most of a year. On paper, it's a document called KV207, and it covers how we harden and temper the valve bodies that go into aircraft fuel systems. It's why Arbor Aerospace Systems put a plant in a town of 8,400 people on their approved supplier list in 2007 and never took us off. By the door, there's a wooden board with hooks on it. On the middle hook hangs a brass stamp about the size of a shotgun shell. KVM1. It weighs almost nothing. Every certified lot that leaves this building carries that mark. People think a stamp like that is a trophy. It isn't. A stamp is a signature you can't take back. When I press it into a tag, I'm telling a company 1,100 miles away that I personally watched every step, and that if a part fails in the air, they can come find me by name. That's not a figure of speech. Arbor keeps a list of the people approved to certify that process at our plant. Nobody else can sign. Nothing ships without a signature. There was exactly one name on that list. I'd been asking them to add a second one for 14 months. Colleen was at the kitchen table when I got home, grading nothing because she retired from the high school library 2 years ago and still can't sit without a pen in her hand. She said, "So, are you retiring?" I said, "Apparently I'm retiring in March." She put the pen down. 39 years of marriage, and she waits. That's her whole method. I opened the laptop and showed her because I wanted somebody to see that I hadn't been asleep. Our quality system logs everything. Anybody with a manager's login can open it and read it. Since July of the year before, I'd filed 14 tickets, and every one of them said a version of the same sentence. This plant has one certified operator of record. He is 63 years old, and qualifying a replacement takes 9 to 12 months. I'd also submitted a plan. Phased retirement, 3 days a week for a year, same hourly rate, no benefits change, and the entire back half of my time spent training whoever they picked. I typed it myself, which took me a Saturday. Lyle answered it in one line. Thanks, Todd. We're going a different direction on knowledge capture. Colleen read it twice, the way she reads a permission slip she doesn't intend to sign. Knowledge capture, she said. Is that a department? I told her I didn't know. I found out 4 days later. It wasn't a department, it was a line item 4.2 in a consulting contract that had already been signed in August, and the meter on it had been running for 6 weeks before anyone thought to mention my retirement to me. Cody Rasmussen has been following me around that bay for 6 years. He's 29. 3 kids under 7 and a wife who works nights at the hospital in Ashford. He came to us out of the vocational program at Calder Ridge Community, and the first thing I noticed about him was that he wrote things down without being told. The second thing was that he asked why. Most of them ask how. He was ready. He'd been ready for 2 years. What he needed was the formal course the witness runs and the customer's sign-off. 9 months of it and about $18,000. I'd put the training requisition in twice. Both times it came back denied with Lyle's initials in the box. That afternoon we were pulling a rack out of number 3, and I told him I was going to file it a third time. He wiped his face with his forearm. He said, "Don't burn a favor on me." I said, "It isn't a favor, it's the process." He was quiet a while. Then he said something that stayed with me longer than it should have. "They told me not to worry about it. They said the software's going to handle that part." I asked him which software. He shrugged. "The consultants have a name for it. I didn't write it down." That was the first time I heard about the consultants from somebody other than a slide, and I remember thinking that a piece of software has never once put its hand into a 900-degree furnace and felt that the load was hanging wrong. I also remember that I didn't ask who was selling it. I've thought about that a lot since. Denise Vollmer runs supplier quality for Arbor Aerospace Systems. We'd worked together for 19 years and never once met in person. We had a standing quarterly call, the first Thursday, 10 a.m. She talks like a woman reading from a form because she usually is. In 19 years, she has never asked me about the weather. She confirmed the closeout audit for the resourcing review, March 27, on-site. I laughed at that, which she did not appreciate. "That's my last day," I said. There was a pause on her end, and I could hear a pen stop. "Then who is your certified operator of record?" On the 28th, I told her the truth. I said I hadn't been authorized to train one. Another pause longer. When she spoke again, her voice hadn't changed at all, which was somehow worse. "Todd, I need this in the right order. Any change to a special process requires written notification to us 30 days ahead. Any change to approved personnel is a change to the process." I said I understood. "I don't think your leadership does," she said. "Are they doing something for you? A dinner?" I told her there was a dinner in March. "Send me the invitation," she said. "I'll come in the day before and close the audit. Then I'll sit in the room and I'll ask them myself." I said that seemed like a long way to fly for a chicken dinner. She didn't laugh. She said one more thing before she hung up, and I heard it again in my head 5 months later, sitting in a folding chair in the front row. "Ask me before your last day, Todd, not after." 2 weeks later, HR sent the project roster to the whole company. 11 names from Sherwood Klein Partners, with titles and headshots. Fourth line down, Bennett Myers, Senior Manager, Operations, Transformation. I'm going to be honest with you about my first reaction, even though it doesn't make me look smart. I was proud. I sat at that computer, and I felt my chest come up off my spine for the first time in a month. My son. On the list. Coming to my plant. I printed it. On the shop printer on the yellow paper, and I folded it into my shirt pocket and carried it around like a kid with a report card. I need to tell you something about 1992 through 1999 so the rest of this lands right. Bennett was born in September of 1992. In the fall of 1998, the number 2 furnace lost its atmosphere control in the middle of a run, and we scrapped 4 weeks of production for our biggest customer at the time. I was 36. I slept in the plant, on a cot, in the maintenance office for the better part of 4 months. I saw my son on Sundays. He was 6. He drew a picture of our house with 4 people standing in front of it, and he drew me separately off at the edge of the paper next to a building with a smokestack. Colleen put it on the refrigerator. I took it down and put it in my wallet, and it's still there, soft as cloth now. That night, I showed Colleen the roster. She didn't smile. She said, "Did he call you first?" He hadn't. Bennett came for dinner on a Sunday the first time in 14 months. He brought Shannon and the baby. Hazel was 5 months old and slept through the entire meal in her carrier on the 4th chair. My son is 34. He wears gray sweaters that cost more than my first car, and he talks in nouns you can't picture: transformation, enablement, throughput posture. Colleen has a way of nodding at those words that I hope he never learns to read. He waited until Colleen brought out the pie. "Dad, I want to run knowledge capture on this engagement myself." I asked what that meant in plain English. 9 sessions, 2 hours each. You talk, I map it. Everything you know about 207. Nell had come over after her shift, still in scrubs. She stopped chewing. I said yes before he finished the sentence. "I want to be straight with you about why, because the reason isn't flattering. For 28 years, my son had never once asked me what I did all day. Not once. He'd ask me for money, and for rides, and for a cosign, and I gave him all 3. He had never asked me about the furnaces. Shannon said it was a great idea. Nell got up and started washing dishes, and she was louder about it than the dishes required. At the door, Bennett pulled a folded page out of his coat. 1 sheet. Engagement Participant Acknowledgement. Just says what we discuss belongs to the project file. Everybody signs it. I signed it on the hall table, without my glasses. That was the only thing I signed all year that I shouldn't have. 9 sessions in 5 weeks in the little conference room off the quality office with the broken thermostat. I brought all 4 notebooks. Brown leather worn down to the cardboard at the corners, 1996 through last year. Furnace curves, load geometry. The 31 adjustments that aren't in the written procedure because I never got permission to revise the written procedure. He asked good questions. That's the part I keep going back over. He'd stop me and say why 40 minutes and not 35, and I'd have to work out loud for a while and he'd wait. Nobody had let me work out loud in 10 years. We ate lunch together 6 times. In his whole life, we've eaten lunch together maybe 9. In the 7th session, he set the laptop down and asked me if I had regrets. I told him about 1998, the cot, the Sundays, the picture on the refrigerator. I told him I'd have done it again, and that it was still the worst thing I ever did to this family. It's the most honest I have ever been with my son, and I said it in a conference room with a broken thermostat, and I was glad. He typed fast while I said it, faster than he'd typed all afternoon. At the end, I pushed the notebooks across the table and told him to take them. They were no good to me in a drawer. In 9 sessions, over 18 hours, my son asked me 400 questions. He never once asked who was certified to sign after I left. At the time, I figured he just forgot. The interim readout was in January. In the training room, 30 managers and a box of pastries. I sat in the back because I'd been invited as a courtesy. Section 4 was called Operational Risk. Bennett ran it. Slide 41 came up, and the room went quiet in a particular way, and I understood the quiet before I understood the slide. The title was Legacy Dependency, a Case Study. There was a photograph of me on it. Me in the bay in front of number 3 holding the tongs. He'd taken it in the 3rd session and told me it was for the documentation file. Under the photo were 3 sentences in italics with quotation marks and no name attached. All 3 were mine. I recognized them the way you recognize your own handwriting on an envelope. One of them was about how the load tells you when it's ready and the pyrometer only confirms it. He'd used it to prove that our process ran on one man's intuition and could not be scaled, audited, or replaced. Ronnie from the tool crib looked back at me. So did Marla from purchasing. Nobody said anything. A woman from finance wrote something down. Bennett didn't look at me once during that section. He looked at the back wall about a foot above my head. He said, "This isn't about one man. It's about a model that doesn't scale." I sat through the rest of it.
40 more minutes and then coffee. Then I went out to the truck and sat in the cab in the north lot without starting the engine. 40 minutes. The windows fogged over.
My phone rang twice, and I didn't pick it up. I kept trying to work out which session each sentence came from. I got all three. The board reviews the program once a quarter on a video call because Marguerite Otway is 71 and lives in Arizona now. Her father built our plant in 1948. She hadn't set foot in it in 6 years. I wasn't in that meeting. Marla was taking minutes, and Marla has never in her life kept a thing to herself. Lyle introduced my son to the chairman of the board as, quote, an objective outside voice. Not a word about the last name. Not a word that the man presenting the case study was the son of the man in the case study. Peg Otway sat in Scottsdale looking at a screen and had no reason on earth to ask. I caught Bennett in the hallway by the vending machines the next morning. I asked him straight out whether he'd declared his relationship to me with his firm. He was looking at his phone. He said, "That gets handled at the partner level, Dad." I said, "Is that a yes?" He said, "The disclosure process is internal," and then he said he had a call, and then he walked toward the stairwell instead of the elevator, which is not a thing he has ever done in that building. I stood there long enough for the vending machine to finish its cycle. Here's what I knew and didn't do anything with. Every consulting firm I've ever dealt with in 45 years has a related party rule. It isn't exotic. You write down who you're related to before you bill the hours, and somebody senior signs off, and it goes in the engagement file. It takes about 4 minutes. He'd been on our site since October. I caught him in the north lot at 6:15 in the evening between his rental and the salt bin. I didn't raise my voice. I want that on the record because Colleen asked me later, and I told her the truth. I said, "You put my picture on a risk slide." He said the photo was cleared under the acknowledgement I signed. He said it in about 11 words. Then he softened and told me nobody in that room thought less of me, and that it was a structural argument, not a personal one. Then I asked why he'd never asked me a single question about the certification, and the softness went out of him like heat off a plate. He said, "Because the certification is the problem, Dad." He told me the rest standing there with his keys in his hand. Renewal comes up April 30, $3.4 million for Phase 2. His name is on the engagement, and the partner committee sits May 6, and a senior manager who loses a renewal doesn't sit in front of that committee. He said, "You think you're irreplaceable. That's your tragedy, not your value." I've turned that sentence over about 1,000 times. It's a good sentence. You probably had it before you had a reason to use it. I drove home. Colleen was asleep. I didn't wake her. At 11:40 that night, I sat down at the kitchen table and opened the quality system and filed ticket number 15. I want to stop for a second because I know some of you are already ahead of me. You're thinking, "Todd, why didn't you walk out that night?" Here's the honest answer: because he was still my son, and I still thought he'd come back around. If you've ever held a door open longer than you should have for one of your own kids, tell me about it down below. I read those. And if you're still with me, tap that like button. It genuinely helps this channel. Now, ticket number 15. I wrote it carefully. I'm not a writer, so it took me an hour and a half. It said that as of March 28, this facility would have no certified operator of record for KV207. It said requalification takes 9 to 12 months and cannot be compressed. It said any change to the process or to approve personnel requires written notification to the customer 30 days in advance. It said the customer's closeout audit was scheduled for March 27th. I copied quality operations and HR. I attached the training requisition for Cody Rasmussen for the 3rd time. I hit submit at 12:52 a.m. At 5:10 the next morning, before I'd finished my first walkthrough, the ticket was closed. Status, duplicate, see modernization program charter. I stood in the bay with my phone in my hand and the furnace ticking behind me and read that word 4 times. Duplicate. Any ticket in that system carries a log. I opened it, closed by, and then a user ID. The ID wasn't quality, it wasn't operations, it was a human resources account. I've worked under 6 quality managers at that plant. Not one of them, not the worst one, would have let a personnel department close a quality ticket. That isn't a rule somebody wrote down. It's the entire reason the system exists. I forwarded the log to the quality manager with one line. Can you explain this? He answered in 40 minutes. He said he'd look into it. He never did look into it, and I've decided not to hold that against him. He had 11 months to retirement himself and a daughter starting at Ohio State, and I know exactly what that math feels like. In February, they started shutting me down in small pieces. My engineering server access got sunset 6 weeks early. I found out when I went to open KV207 to add a revision note about the number 3 door seal, and the screen said my permissions had changed. That document has my name in the author field. I wrote it in 1996. I could read it, and I could not touch it. Then my desk moved. They needed the quality annex for the project team, so maintenance carried my desk out into the corridor by the men's room and set it against the wall with the extension cord running along the baseboard. Ronnie taped a paper sign above it that said Executive Suite, and it was the only thing that made me laugh for 2 weeks. Dana Pryor from HR asked me for coffee. 51 warm handshake remembers your wife's name and your wife's surgery. She started with, Todd, we're all family here. Then she slid over a folder. Retirement paperwork, benefits, election Cobra. I signed what needed signing. There was a second page under it that she kept flat with 2 fingers. I asked what that one was. That's a nice thing, she said. Let's talk about it closer to the dinner. I asked her again. She smiled and said, Don't make me be the bad guy here. I want to be fair to her. I think she believed that. I think when she got in her car, she felt like somebody who'd handled a difficult conversation with grace. That was the first time anybody mentioned the letter to me. The second time it was on a table with a pen next to it, and there were 140 people watching. The dinner got upgraded in the first week of March. It started as cake in the break room. It became Otway Hall, the old dining room on the north end that the founder built in 1961, with the low ceiling and the cream tile and the black and white photographs on the wall. 14 round tables, rented linens, both shifts invited, plus managers, plus the board, plus customers. I learned about all of it from an automated email, a calendar invitation to my own retirement dinner sent to the all-staff distribution list at 4:02 on a Tuesday afternoon. I read it on my phone in the corridor at the desk by the men's room. Attached was the program. 1 page. Welcome, Lyle Kearns. Presentation of Service Award. Dinner. And above dinner, in bold, Tribute Address Bennett Myers. The third shift lathe operators found out the same minute I did. That's the part that got under my skin and stayed there. Not that they'd chosen him. That they'd never once considered that I might want to be asked. I called my son from the truck. I asked him if it was true. He said, Dad, I thought you'd be happy. He said it fast and a little hurt, like I'd taken something from him. I asked him what he was planning to say. There was a gap on the line. 2 seconds, maybe 3. I've replayed it enough times to be sure about that. Then he said, I'm still working on it. He was not still working on it. It had been in the deck since January. We had the fight in our kitchen on a Thursday. Colleen said I shouldn't go. I told her a man goes to his own retirement dinner. She said, a man doesn't have to sit for it. Nell came straight from a 12-hour shift and stood at the counter, eating cold chicken out of the pan. And she'd clearly been building this on the drive over. She said, Dad, they're not honoring you. They're using you as an exhibit. I told her that her brother wouldn't do that. She put the pan down. She said, he already did it, in January, with a photograph. There's a thing between those two I haven't been fair about. 3 years ago, Bennett told his sister she was wasting a degree pushing a med cart. He said it at Thanksgiving, and he said it once, and she has not been in a room alone with him since. 9 months without a phone call at that point. I said, he's under pressure, he's got a baby, and Nell looked at me the way you look at a man who has just said something you're going to think about for a long time, and she said, Dad, you say that about him every single time. Colleen didn't take my side, and she didn't take Nell's. She waited until Nell left. Then she said she'd come to the dinner. I'll sit right beside you, she said, but I'm not going to clap. I said that was fine. 3 weeks out, I still believed I could fix it inside the building, the way you fix everything else, with a form. I asked Lyle Kearns for 15 minutes, and he gave me 25, which I'll grant him. I made one offer, 90 days past March 27, no raise, no benefits. Same hourly, straight time, and every hour of it spent starting Cody Rasmussen down the qualification path, so the customer had a second name to look at before the end of the year. Lyle listened all the way through, which most men in his job don't. Then he said the quarter's budget was locked, and that the modernization program's whole thesis was reducing single operator dependency, and that hiring the single operator back to train a new single operator was, in his words, the opposite of the strategy. I said, somebody has to sign the tags on Monday. He said, the system will handle certification routing. I have thought about that sentence more than any other sentence in this story. He wasn't lying to me. He genuinely believed it. Somewhere in a deck in a box with an arrow it said so. Then he brightened up and slid a page across the desk. Goodwill availability letter, 24 months. I agree to remain reachable by phone for technical questions at no cost, in recognition of my long relationship with the company. Lyle said, it's a nice gesture, costs you nothing. I asked what it paid. He laughed like I'd made a joke, and then he stopped because I hadn't. Then he said the part that decided the rest of it. You'll sign it at the dinner. We're building it into the program. They had put my signature on the agenda. I folded the letter into thirds. I put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. I did not sign it. 6 days before the dinner, Cody brought me a spiral-bound copy of the final deck. Print shop had run 40 of them for the table settings. He set it on my desk in the corridor and didn't say anything, and then he walked away, which is how I knew. Appendix C, page 104. Same photograph. Me at number 3, tongs in hand. Underneath it, one line of caption. Single point of failure, 41 years tenure, no documented succession. 41 years. He couldn't even get the number right. He'd used the year I moved to Heat Treat instead of the year I was hired. And nobody at that firm had checked, because nobody at that firm had ever asked me anything except through him. I turned to the front. Engagement charter, page 2, the boilerplate nobody reads. Related party disclosures, none declared. Then I sat there, in a corridor outside a men's room, and went through that whole book, all 140 pages, looking for one thing. It wasn't there. Not in the risk register, not in the customer section, not in the transition plan. Nowhere in that document, which cost this company $1.1 million, was there a single reference to Arbor's approved personnel list, or to the 30-day notification requirement, or to the fact that a special process at this plant is signed by a named human being and not by a system. They hadn't hidden it. That's what took me a while to accept. They didn't know it existed. And on the 27th of March, they were going to stand up in a room that included our largest customer and announce that they were retiring the process. Let me step out of it for 1 minute here, because this is where I had a decision to make. 6 days out, sitting at my kitchen table with that appendix in front of me, I could warn the men who'd spent 5 months calling me obsolete. Or I could let them walk into it. I'll tell you what I decided in a second. First, if you're watching this from a town like mine, put the name of it below. I want to see how many of us there are. Back to that kitchen table. I did warn them. I want to say that plainly because it's the only part of this I'm actually proud of. Ticket 16 went in that Tuesday. Same language, shorter. It was closed in 90 minutes. Same status. Duplicate. So the second decision was the real one, and I made it at 2 in the morning in my garage. For 6 weeks I'd been building something nobody asked me for. A handover binder. 340 pages. Every furnace curve, every load geometry, every one of the 31 adjustments that live in my head. And in 4 leather notebooks and nowhere else. Photographs, the failure log from 1996, all 11 of them, with what each one taught me. It was sitting on my workbench in a banker's box, and I stood there and thought about pulling 12 pages out of it. The compensation offsets for number 3, the oldest furnace, the one with the door seal that has never sealed right since 2011. You don't run that furnace off the set point. You run it off a correction that I worked out over 4 years, and it is not written anywhere else on this earth. Nobody would know. Nobody could ever prove it. And in about 6 weeks, every man in that plant would have understood exactly what they'd lost. I stood there a long time with my hand on the box. Then I thought about 60 jobs in a town of 8,400 people, and I thought about Cody's 3 kids, and I put my hand down. Everything I owed them, complete, signed for, witnessed, dated, and not one single thing I didn't. 2 days later, my son called me and asked for a favor.
He called on the Thursday from a car on speaker. He said the tribute was coming along.
He said he wanted it to have something real in it, and not just service award language. He said, "Give me one honest story about your limitations." I asked what he meant. Something that shows you're human, something with a cost. He already had it. He'd had it since the 7th session, in that conference room with the broken thermostat. But he wanted me to give it to him again, knowing what it was for, because a thing you're handed is easier to use than a thing you took. So I gave it to him again. 1998. The atmosphere control on number 2. 4 months on a cot in the maintenance office. Sundays. The picture on the refrigerator with me drawn off at the edge of the paper, next to a building with a smokestack. I told him I was sorry. In 34 years, I'd said that to him maybe twice, and both times it was about a car. He was quiet for a second, and I thought that we were getting somewhere. Then he asked me one follow-up question. So if you'd gotten sick that fall, the plant would have shut down? I said yes. I said it without a thought in my head, the way you answer a man asking about the weather. He said, "Okay, that's helpful. Thanks, Dad." And he hung up. I gave my son the worst 4 months of my life. He thanked me for the material. March 27 was a Thursday. Rain in the morning, clear by 4. I want you to see who walked into that room because every one of them mattered, and not one of them knew it yet. Denise Vollmer flew in at 7 a.m. She spent the day on the audit and closed it at 4:10 in the afternoon in the quality office. 55 years old, gray suit, black leather case that she set down under her chair at table 4 and did not open. Marguerite Otway drove up from the Columbus airport, 71 years old, first time in that building since 2020. She stopped in the doorway and looked at the photograph of her father on the north wall for a while, before anybody noticed she'd arrived. Grant Sadler came in from Chicago, principal at Sherwood Klein 49, and he was there for exactly one reason. The Phase 2 renewal was on the table for April 30, and he intended to shake hands on it before he left. Cody Rasmussen wore the only shirt he owns with a collar. He kept touching the button at his throat. Colleen sat down on my right and did not pick up her wineglass all evening. Nell came late and sat at the last table by the door in scrubs because she'd worked a double and she wanted to be able to leave. Shannon had Hazel in the back in the carrier, and on the head table, under a white cloth and engraved plaque, a bunch of white chrysanthemums from the grocery store in Ashford, and a pen. Every single person who could ask the right question was in that room. Not one of them knew they were about to. Lyle opened. 4 minutes and I'll say he did it well. He talked about the founder. He talked about a town that builds things. He said 45 years and let it sit. Then he said, and now someone uniquely qualified to speak to Todd's legacy. Bennett came up in a navy jacket, no tie. He tapped the microphone once and it gave a small squeal and about half the room flinched. The first 3 minutes were real. I need you to understand that because it's what made the rest of it work on that room. He told them about the bicycle. 8 years old, the gravel apron behind the plant on a Sunday, and how I ran alongside him holding the seat for the better part of 2 hours and never once let go before he told me to. He got the details right. He got the color of the bike right. Colleen's shoulders came down. I felt it through the chair. Somebody at table 9 said, "Aw," out loud. Then he put both hands on the podium. He said, "And because I love him, I'm going to be honest with you tonight." Behind him, the lights over the head table dimmed by about half. I heard the pulley on the projection screen start to run. Nobody had told me the tribute had slides. Colleen's hand came over and flattened on my knee. And then my son said the sentence that put me on the front page of 140 people's memories. "My father is a good man. My father is also outdated." There was laughter. I want to be precise about it because it's the detail people always want. It came from 2 tables. The management tables up front on the left. It was polite laughter, the kind you give a speaker who's taken a small risk, and it lasted about 2 seconds. Then it stopped because the machinists weren't doing it, and you can hear a room split. The screen came up, slide 41. My photograph, 10 feet tall, tongs in my hand. Bennett told them about 1998. He told them about the cot. He told them about 4 months. He told them my son saw me on Sundays, and he said it in the third person about himself, which I did not expect and did not enjoy. Then he said, "One man. If he'd gotten the flu that fall, this plant stops. That isn't heroism, that's an unmanaged risk." He clicked forward. Phase 2 retirement of final legacy manual process, effective March 30. He said it out loud with the date into a microphone in a room with a customer in it. At table 9, Marla put her fork down. Then a couple of others did. Then the whole back half of that room went quiet in a way I have never heard a room go quiet. And the only sound in Otway Hall was Hazel starting to cry somewhere behind me. I sat in the front row. At table 4, Denise Vollmer set down her glass, reached under her chair, and opened her case. I stood up. Nobody stopped me. Dana Pryor half rose with the plaque because everyone assumed I was coming up to accept it. Lyle started to clap, and 2 tables joined him, and it died out fast. I didn't go to the podium. I stayed where I was, in front of my chair, and I spoke at a normal volume, and the room was quiet enough that it carried. I thanked the company. 45 years, 1 employer, 3 cars, a mortgage paid off, 2 kids through school. That's not nothing, and I meant it. I thanked Peg Otway for coming, and I thanked my son for being honest, and I meant that too, in a way I'd have to explain for longer than we have. Then I asked my question. Who is the certified operator of record on Monday morning? Lyle looked at the quality manager. The quality manager looked at Cody. Cody looked down at the tablecloth. The projector fan was the loudest thing in that building. I let it sit about 4 seconds. Then I asked the second one. And has Arbor been notified of the process change? Grant Sadler turned in his seat all the way around and looked at Bennett. Bennett was still at the podium with the clicker in his hand. He said, "Dad, this isn't the venue." I said, "It's the venue you picked." Nobody answered either question. Denise Vollmer stood up at table 4. "My name is Denise Vollmer. I'm Director of Supplier Quality for Arbor Aerospace Systems." You could watch it move across that room. Arbor is 60% of our volume. Half those people had never seen her face, and every one of them knew the name off a packing slip. She held up one sheet. "This is the approved personnel list for Special Process KV-207 at this facility. It has one name on it." She read it. Todd Myers. Then she turned toward the head table, and she never once raised her voice. "Our supplier agreement requires written notification 30 days before any change to a special process or its approved personnel. I received the audit package this morning. It contained no such notification." She looked at the screen, slide still up. "Effective March 30. I'm hearing it announced tonight with the rest of the room." Lyle said something about routing and systems. She said, "New releases are suspended Monday pending resourcing." And then Peg Otway stood up, 71 years old, at table 1, and she didn't ask Lyle anything. She turned to Grant Sadler. "Mr. Sadler, was a related party disclosure filed for this engagement?" Sadler looked at Bennett. Bennett looked at the floor of a room his grandfather's generation built. Sadler said, "I'll have to check." That was the moment 140 people worked out 2 things at once. That the man they just laughed at was the only reason anything left that building, and that the man at the podium was his son and had never written it down. I went out to the truck and came back with the banker's box, and I want you to know that nobody helped me carry it. I set it on the head table beside the plaque and the grocery store flowers, 3 things in order. First, the binder, 340 pages. I said loud enough for the room, "This is the complete handover, everything I owe you." I signed the transfer log. I asked Denise Vollmer to witness it, and she came up and signed. I asked Cody to witness it, and his hand shook so hard he had to do his last name twice. Second, the stamp. I took KVM1 out of my jacket pocket and set it on the white cloth in the middle of that table. Brass about the size of a shotgun shell. There's a worn spot on the right edge shaped like a thumbnail. Nobody reached for it. 8 managers at that table, and not one hand moved. Third, I reached into the inside pocket and took out the Goodwill availability letter, folded in thirds since the 2nd week of March. I opened it flat and set it down next to the pen, unsigned. I said one thing to that room, and then I was done talking. "I've given you everything I owe. I'm not giving you what I don't. I put my hand out, and Colleen took it, and we walked the length of Otway Hall past 14 tables. Nobody clapped. The machinist stood up. Monday, 7:02 a.m. Arbor's letter came in on the corporate address and got forwarded around the plant inside of an hour, because everything does. New release authorizations for the entire KV-207 family suspended pending resourcing. Standard language, 3 paragraphs. There were 3 pallets banded and shrink-wrapped on the outbound dock, $214,000 of finished valve bodies tagged and staged, with nobody legally able to sign the certs. They sat on that dock for 11 weeks. Requalification estimate came back at 9 to 12 months. Horse witnessed, runs customer source approval. The exact number I'd been putting in tickets since July of the year before. Lyle's program had been booked at $1.9 million in operational savings for the fiscal year. By the second week of April, finance had rebooked it as a $2.6 million disruption reserve. That's a $4.5 million swing on a spreadsheet, and every dollar of it came out of a decision that a training requisition for $18,000 wasn't worth the money. I was in my garage rebuilding a carburetor when Cody texted me. They asked me to sign the tags. I told them I'm not qualified. You taught me that. I read it 4 times. I'm not embarrassed to tell you I had to sit down on the step. At 7:40 my phone rang. Dana Pryor. I let it go. She called 10 more times over the next 2 days. Sherwood Klein pulled my son off the engagement inside 48 hours. Not for the slide. Nobody cared about the slide. They pulled him for 4 minutes of paperwork he never did. The related party disclosure, which their own charter says gets filed before the first hour is billed. The Phase 2 renewal died on the table. $3.4 million, gone on April 2, 28 days before it would have been signed. His name came off the partner committee docket for May 6th. Grant Sadler flew home and never came back to Ohio. Peg Otway called an emergency board meeting for the following Tuesday and drove back up from Scottsdale for it. Lyle Kearns was moved into a special projects role, which is what a company says when it means 7 more weeks. He was gone by the end of May. Dana Pryor left me a 4-minute voicemail. She said she'd been put in an impossible position. She said she hoped I understood that she had always been on my side. She said the word family twice. The Calder Ridge Record ran a piece about the shipping suspension on page 3. 200 words. They quoted the plant's statement and nobody else. My name isn't in it anywhere. I was glad about that. Genuinely glad. In a town this size, being in the paper is a thing that happens to you, not for you. People kept asking me that spring whether I felt vindicated. I mostly felt tired, and I kept thinking about 3 pallets sitting on a dock. Lyle called first in his last week, still trying. $85 an hour on a contractor agreement reporting to operations. I told him no as politely as I could manage, and I did manage it. 2 days later, Peg Otway drove out to my house herself. 71 years old in a rental sedan, and she stood on my porch until Colleen made her come in and sit down. She didn't apologize for Lyle. She apologized for herself. She said, I haven't read anything in 6 years. That's on me. So I told her my terms. I'd written them on a legal pad the night before because I've learned that if I don't write it down, I talk myself out of half of it. 1. Cody Rasmussen goes through full qualification. 12 months, company pays every dollar of it. 2. His name goes on the process document next to mine, not underneath, next to. 3. Training budget for 3 technicians a year committed for 5 years in writing in the board minutes. 4. I report to the board, not to operations. 5. Market rate. And then I said a number out loud to another human being about my own work for the first time in 45 years. My voice did something funny in the middle of it. She didn't seem to notice. She wrote all 5 down and said yes to all 5. Then at the door, she said she intended to report my son to his professional association. I said no. She looked at me a long moment. I said, he's paying for it. He doesn't need me to send the bill. He came to the house at 20 to 12 on a Tuesday night in April. Shannon was on shift. He had Hazel in the carrier asleep, and he set her down on the kitchen floor between us and didn't take his coat off. He argued for 5 minutes first. He said Arbor would have suspended anyway.
He said the disclosure was a technicality. He said I'd humiliated him in front of the principal of his own firm. I let him get all the way through it. That's the one useful thing about being 64. Then he stopped and put both hands on the back of a chair and something went out of his face. He said, "You want to know why I do this for a living?" I said yes. He said, "I was 6. You were gone 4 months. You know what I figured out that year?" I said no. That the ones who can be replaced get left behind.
And there it was sitting on my kitchen floor next to my granddaughter, 34 years old. My son had built an entire career out of proving that human beings are replaceable so that he would never in his life be one of the ones who could be. I told him the truth about 1998, which I had never told anybody, including Colleen. I told him I didn't stay for the plant. I stayed because I was 36 years old and terrified, and I did not know how to come home and admit I couldn't fix it. He cried. I did not go around the table. I said, "You can come Sunday, bring her." He said, "Okay." I said, "Don't bring the deck. Not in this house, not for a year." He picked up the carrier and said okay again. I went back on the second Monday in April. 3 days a week contract signed with the board. They didn't put my desk in the corridor. I want to be honest and say I checked before I got out of the truck. Ronnie had saved the executive suite sign. It's on the wall of the heat treat office now over the coffee maker, and every new hire asks about it, and every one of them gets a different answer. Lyle Kearns left in May. He shook my hand on the way out and said, "I thought I was saving this place." I believe he did think that. That's the part nobody wants to hear. He wasn't a villain in a movie. He was a man who trusted a box with an arrow in it over 45 years of somebody who never learned how to say his own worth out loud. Dana Pryor is still there. She still says we're all family here. I nod at her in the hallway and I keep walking, and that's the whole arrangement, and it works fine. I teach Tuesday nights now at Calder Ridge Community College. Basic metallurgy and process control 6 to 9 in a room with a bad projector. 14 students the first term. 7 of them work at Kestrel. They gave me back the same job. I just came in through a different door. 9 months later in January, Denise Vollmer flew back for the resourcing audit. She spent 2 days in the bay with a clipboard, and she watched Cody Rasmussen run 3 loads front to back with his hands and his eyes and nothing else, and on the afternoon of the second day, she signed. The approved personnel list for KV-207 at this facility now has 2 names on it. They gave him his own stamp. KVR-1. Purchasing ordered it out of the same catalog we've used since 1994, and it came in a paper envelope, and Ronnie made a whole ceremony out of handing it over in the break room. Cody cried in front of 11 men in that bay, and not one of them said a word about it, then or since. That's my favorite thing that has ever happened in that building. I certified the last lot of my working life that same afternoon. I pressed KVM-1 into the tag, and my hand knew the pressure the way it has known it since 1996, and then I walked over to the wooden board by the door and hung it back on the middle hook. Cody hung his on the hook beside it. I'll tell you something I never told them. I started that 340-page binder in the second week of February, 6 weeks before the dinner. Before Denise Vollmer ever said she'd come, before I saw Appendix C, before I had the first idea how any of it would land. I didn't build it because I knew what was coming. I built it because it was the work. Bennett works at a smaller firm now out of Columbus. 9 people. They do knowledge transfer for manufacturers, and they do it the slow way, which means they do it honestly, and he makes about 40% less than he used to. He comes for dinner most Sundays. Hazel is 19 months old and has opinions about the dog. Nell started talking to him again in the fall. Not warmly. It took her most of a year, and it took him a real apology, and I stayed out of the whole thing, which is the hardest parenting I have ever done. 2 weeks ago, he was out on my porch after dinner, and he asked me something. He said, "Would you teach me?" The actual work. I told him Tuesdays, 7 o'clock, register like everybody else. He laughed. Then he saw I wasn't kidding, and he registered on his phone right there on the step. This morning I got to the plant at 5. I sat in the truck for a second the way I have since 1981, and then I went in through the personnel door and turned on the lights in the heat treat bay. 90 degrees.
Scorched oil and hot brick. The furnace is breathing. By the door on the wooden board, two brass stamps hang side by side. One of them is worn down on the right edge in the shape of a thumbnail. The other one is still bright. They told me I was outdated. What they meant was that I was replaceable. Those turned out to be two different words. It took 45 years and one very bad speech before anybody in that room learned the difference. So that's where it ended, and now I want to ask you something. If you'd been sitting in that front row, would you have stood up and asked the question the way I did? Or would you have walked out the second that slide went up, type 1 or 2 down below? There's no wrong answer, I'm just curious which one of us you are. And if this one landed somewhere close to home, there's another story waiting for you in the description about the afternoon my brother read our father's will out loud. Take care of yourself. I'll see you over there.